we're going to go through the initial setup of a carb cheater device here. So you go scroll down from the top, hit your Bluetooth. Now I've got my car turned on over here. There should be a carb cheater, and the pin number is 1234. Okay, and then it should go to paired, and then it may go to available or disconnected or previously connected or something like that. It doesn't always stay paired because we don't send data when it's not hooked to the Carb Cheater app. So now we need to download the Carb Cheater app. Go to the Play Store here. Search Google Play. Carb Cheater. Ignore all of the dieting apps. And this is the one you're looking for. Carb Cheater Beta. Alright. Installed. Open. So we've already connected to Bluetooth. We're going to go right here where it says connect module. It'll start flashing. You click and hold, and you go until you find Carb Cheater. A lot of times there's a lot of devices here. If you have a Android phone and you use it every day, just search for this Carb Cheater one. Now here's where you put in your product key. So your box here will have a serial number and key written on the box. If you can't find it or you lose it or whatever, just let us know. We keep track of those. On this unit, it's just a test unit, so it's 9999. You hit OK. And now you got all these initial settings. Most of the time, the default settings are totally fine. If you have a vehicle that revs higher than 5,000 RPM, you may want to change this. Or less than 5,000 RPM. But most of the time you can just leave this alone. Return to main screen. You got to click and hold every button on here. So here you have a few different options. So I've connected this one before, so the auto tune is normally off here. So you've got a few different settings here. First we'll talk about this middle one here, the press and hold vacuum setting. So if you have auto tune on in cruising mode or both, if you go below this 9 inches of mercury, what it'll do is it'll close the valve, hard close, and then it'll try and target 12.5 AFR. That's hard set, not changeable. Alright, so if we turn auto tune on or off, we'll go back to on. We say we accept. You can select idle only, cruise only, or if you hit cancel, it's for both. And then you have two different options here. You have RPM dependent or AFR dependent idle. We'll go into AFR first, just because that's easier to explain. So you got your AFR here, this 13.5. It is going to target that AFR. So get the handy dandy paper out here. So we said 13.5 is our target. Oh. Kids' crayons are already broken. 13.5 AFR is your target. So what it'll do is it'll say 13.3, so like 0.2 less AFR. This is its good window. See, I promise I didn't break these. This is the good window. Anything more or less than that, if it's higher than that, it tries to close the valve. If it's lower than that, it tries to open the valve. It tries to get you into this happy area. Now, with that, you also have this RPM. Now it does look at that. So you said 700. That means it'll go to 500 or 900 RPM. And then also with that, this plus 350 is going to be your cruising. So 10, 50. Anything above that, it goes into cruising AFR mode. Cruising AFR mode. And that is an entirely different, it changes to different numbers there. So this is just a safety. If you go below 500, it'll open the valve even if it creeps it above 13.5. If you go above 900, it closes the valve. So sometimes you have it set to this 13.5, and depending on your vehicle, it'll either change your RPM a lot or it'll change it very little. Sometimes it'll make your RPM start at 700 and go all the way up to 900, which is the problem with the AFR mode. And if it hits this 900, it'll stop. That is just to keep you from going all the way into your AFR cruise, or to go so low that it basically doesn't allow it to idle. Now, that's the AFR idle mode. And we shut this back off. Turn it back on. Go through the same steps as before. I accept both. And then idle RPM. This is the preferred method. Idle RPM. So with this, same settings as before. 700, 13.5. So we'll flip this over. So now we're idle dependent. So now 700 is our target RPM. If you go 50 below or 50 above, so 650 to 750, that is the happy range. That is where everything is good and happy. This is, we allow 50 plus or minus just for bigger cams. Sometimes they'll bounce back and forth. We don't want that valve just constantly opening and closing. So we consider 50 to be acceptable. So then you got your AFR as a backup because we don't want it to go super lean. So the AFR is still set to 13.5. You take this number plus 1, and 12.5 is always the minimum. This is considered the good range, but a secondary to this. So this whole area is acceptable in the AFR range. If it gets above this 14.5, it'll start closing the valve. Below this 12.5, it opens the valve. Even if the RPM is within this range, it'll still do that. So say you get, up to this 750 range, you start getting into the 800 as an example. So say you're idling at 800 over here, but you're at 12, it'll still open that valve to try and get you above this 12.5. This is always the AFR is the secondary thing, but it's the most important thing. We don't want you idling at 12. We don't want you idling, above 1 above what you set. So typically this 13 to 14 range is a happy AFR. If you get all the way up into the, if you have this set to 14 and this is 15 now, 14 plus 1 is 15. This is okay. Idling at 15 is really not that big of a deal as long as your car is happy with it. But typically you want to be in that, 13.5 is a good place to start. That's a good happy start. So hopefully all this makes sense. The RPM dependent version, AFR, +1 and 12.5, and plus or minus 50 on the RPM. Then idle AFR mode, we're targeting that 13.5. I think it's plus or minus 2, but it's typically a little bit lower with, RPM plus or minus 200 as the acceptable range. But you have to remember, this whole time, if you get below this 9 inches of mercury, you're jumped straight into the high load. Less than 9, you get into the high load setting, which is, you target 12.5 AFR, which is real rich at idle, but that's your highest power and safest AFR at high load. So say you have a cam that idles at 9, you're going to want to set this at 4 or 5. But whatever, typically you want this set a little bit lower than what you will ever hit when you're cruising at 65, whatever, and going up a hill. Now in the future, once you've connected to this once, you can just hit OK. If you want to get back into your main settings menu, retype in your pin code. Now the settings menu, I'll kind of run through them real fast. Idle AFR, you can also set them on the main screen there. Cruise AFR, same thing. Once you get into the cruising setting, that main screen will show you your cruise AFR setting. Cylinder count, we default to 8, but if you have a 6-cylinder, 4-cylinder, whatever, you need to change it there. Limiter RPM, we have default to 5,000, I believe, but you can change that up or down depending on the vehicle. 2-step RPM, so there's a 2-step wire in there. There's another video showing you how to install it, but that sets the RPM that you want the 2-step to activate at. 3,000 RPM seems pretty good. If you're doing it for street stuff, it sounds pretty aggressive. Shoots really nice fireballs, etc. If you're doing it for race stuff, you're going to want to adjust that, I'm sure, depending on your launch RPM. Custom relay here, you can use that for, shift light, whatever. But it will turn on at 4,500. You can also test it. That's just a momentary. Or you can toggle and save. People with MSD boxes can use that for like an ignition or ignition lock, since you can't do that with an MSD box, whatever. But this is just on when your carb cheater has power and off when it's off. RPM dependent here, you can set it to whatever, 4,500. If you want to shift light, click save. Again, you got to click and hold all of these. Tuning percent limit. So if you have a smaller engine than, like a 302, 350, V8, you may want to tune these down if your valve is opening or closing too quickly or too much or whatever. This basically just limits how far that valve will open and close, both idle and cruise. And then this is for if you have an external wideband gauge and you're hooking it into the carb cheater rather than using the internal one. 0 to 5 volts is typically 10 to 20 AFR. It's all dependent on the gauge. You're going to have to look it up in your manual. But yep, that basically covers it. Got to click and hold to return to the main screen. Mode will switch screens. You can start and stop a data log from this screen. You can open up the dash. This is what automatically comes up once you've connected to it once. And mode comes back to these. I think that's it. If you guys have any questions, let me know.